My husband leaned across the dinner table at his colleague's house and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, honestly? Mia's the reason our firm hasn't scaled. She plays it safe. Always has. They laughed. His boss nodded slowly, like this was insight. I set my wine glass down and said, then I'll stop holding you back. Tonight. And I meant it. Let me back up. My name is Mia Hartwell. 3 years ago, I was a senior architect at a mid-size firm in Austin, Texas, not a junior associate finding her footing, not someone riding her husband's coattails. I was the person clients called when a project was 3 weeks from collapse. I was the one who rebuilt the Creston Medical Center proposal after the lead designer quit mid-contract. I was the one who flew to Denver on a Tuesday and came back Thursday with a signed deal worth $4.2 million. My husband, Owen, was also an architect. We'd met in graduate school at UT Austin, fallen in love over site plans and studio critique nights, and built what I thought was a partnership based on mutual respect. We'd been married for 9 years. For 7 of those 9 years, I had quietly, steadily outpaced him, not because I wanted to compete, because I couldn't help it. Design was the thing I was genuinely, deeply good at, and I'd never learned how to be average at things I cared about. Owen had charm. He had handshakes and golf weekends, and a confidence in rooms that I didn't naturally have. He was better at client dinners than I was, more comfortable talking about himself, more willing to take credit in meetings without clarifying who'd actually drawn the plans. For a long time, I told myself that was fine. We were a team. What difference did it make whose name was on the email if the project succeeded? I learned what difference it made the night of Philip Bauer's dinner party. Philip was Owen's boss, a named partner at Bauer Donnelly Associates, the firm where Owen had worked for 3 years. Owen had invited me to this dinner as what he called a show of solidarity before a major internal review the following week. There were 8 of us at the table, Philip and his wife, 2 other senior partners, a newly promoted associate named Kevin and his girlfriend, and Owen and me. The wine was good. The conversation was easy, the way conversations are when everyone at the table has roughly the same income and nobody's pretending. We talked about a new mixed-use development going up downtown. Philip mentioned a project that had recently stalled, a residential complex in the Mueller neighborhood that had lost its lead designer. He said it almost offhandedly, the way you mention a problem when you've already accepted you can't solve it. I'd heard about the Mueller project. I knew the firm it belonged to. I'd actually worked with one of the engineers on it 2 years earlier. I said, I think there's a workaround on the structural issue if you're willing to revisit the load distribution on the east wing. It's not a redesign, it's more of a recalibration. Philip looked at me with genuine interest. You've reviewed the specs, not formally, but I know the site. I worked adjacent to it in 2021. We talked for about 10 minutes. I walked him through a rough approach. He pulled out his phone and started making notes. And then Owen laughed. It was a specific kind of laugh. Light, dismissive, the laugh you use when you want to reframe something as charming instead of dangerous. She does this, he said, looking around the table. Gets excited and jumps ahead. We've talked about it. He smiled at me in a way that was meant to look affectionate. Mia plays it safe in practice but then overreaches in conversation. It's a blind spot. The table shifted. Not dramatically. Just slightly. Philip put his phone away. Kevin's girlfriend looked at her plate. Owen's boss nodded in a way that suggested he was filing this information somewhere. I looked at my husband. He was still smiling. Comfortable. Sure of himself. Completely unaware, or completely unbothered, by what he'd just done. I excused myself to use the restroom. I stood at the sink for 2 full minutes. I looked at my own face in the mirror. I thought about the Morrison Medical Center. I thought about Denver. I thought about the 3 times in the past year that Owen had presented my work in meetings as our approach, while I sat quietly beside him, because that was easier, because it wasn't worth the friction, because I'd believed that what was ours. I thought about the blind spot comment. I went back to the table. I finished my wine. I smiled at Philip's wife and asked about her garden renovation, which she was happy to discuss. I waited until Owen started a new story about a conference he'd attended in Phoenix. Then I said, clearly and without drama, "Philip, I'd be glad to put together a formal proposal on the Muller site if you're interested. I can have something to you by Thursday." Philip said he'd appreciate that. I did not look at Owen. We drove home in silence for 4 minutes. Then Owen said I'd embarrassed him, said I'd gone around him, said I had a habit of making everything about myself in professional situations and he was tired of managing it. I said, "I think we both know that's not what happened tonight." He said, "Here we go." I said, "I'm not doing this in the car." When we got home, I went to the bedroom. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't call anyone. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought carefully about what I knew and what I was only beginning to understand. The Muller proposal took me 11 hours over 2 days. I sent it to Philip on a Thursday as promised. By the following Monday, he'd replied asking if I could come in and present it to the team. I didn't tell Owen until the night before the meeting. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. He didn't say congratulations, he said, "You went directly to Philip without telling me." I said, "I told you about it." He said, "You mentioned it. You didn't consult me." I said, "It's my proposal, Owen." He left for the gym and didn't come back until 11. When he got into bed, he said, "You're going to make this harder than it needs to be." I lay there in the dark thinking about 9 years, about all the ways I had bent myself into shapes that were easier for him to hold. The meeting with Philip went well. Exceptionally well, actually. He offered me a consulting contract by the end of the week, not under Owen's firm, but independently through my own LLC, which I'd set up 2 years earlier mostly out of habit, and partly out of a quiet instinct I hadn't fully examined yet. The contract was worth $380,000. It was the largest individual contract of my career. I came home and made dinner. Owen came home from work, poured himself a drink and said, "How did it go?" I said, "Really well. I got the contract." He nodded and scrolled his phone. He said, "Proud of you," in the same tone you use when someone parallel parks on the first try. Something in me went very still. 2 weeks after the Philip dinner, I ran into Kevin, the associate who'd been at the party, in the parking garage at a conference. He seemed uncomfortable when he saw me. Made small talk too carefully. I noticed it but didn't press. He texted me that evening, a number I didn't have saved. He said, "I don't know if I should be sending this, but I heard something at work this week that I think you should know about. Can we talk?" We met for coffee the next morning. Kevin was 29, sharp, a little anxious. He sat across from me with both hands around his cup and said, "Owen's been telling people at the firm that you have a stability problem, like an emotional one. He said the Muller proposal was partly his, that you ran with his concept without crediting him. He's been saying it for a while actually, since before the dinner party." I asked him how long. He said, "At least 6 months, maybe more. There's a group text. I'm in it because I started at the firm around the same time he did, and I guess he assumed." He stopped. "I should have said something sooner. I'm sorry." I asked him to forward me what he could. He said he already had. I sat in the parking lot of that coffee shop for 20 minutes before I started the car. I did not cry. I was past the part where I would cry about this and hadn't known it until right then. Over the next 3 days, I learned the following things. Owen had told at least 4 colleagues that my involvement in any projects we discussed at home was supportive, not creative. He'd positioned himself as the architect who tolerated a wife who occasionally wanted to feel included. He had screenshots he'd taken of my sketchbooks, actual photographs of my hand-drawn plans, that he'd shared in a group chat with the caption, "Her therapy. She processes through drawing. It's kind of sweet." He'd also contacted 2 of my former clients from before we were married. I didn't know this until my phone rang on a Thursday afternoon and it was Diane Rossiter, who'd hired me to design her Barton Hills home in 2017. Diane said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know this is coming from a good place. Your husband called me last week. He asked me some strange questions about your emotional state, about whether you'd ever seemed erratic or hard to work with. I told him absolutely not, but I thought you should know." I asked her what else he'd said. She told me. He'd told Diane he was concerned. He'd suggested that some of my recent professional behavior had been uncharacteristic and that he was trying to build a picture to support her if she was ever asked. He'd done this casually, the way you slip a knife between someone's ribs while asking if they're warm enough. I thanked Diane. I told her I was fine. I hung up and called my attorney. Her name was Frances Adler. She'd come highly recommended by a colleague who'd gone through a business dispute 3 years earlier. Frances had the steady, focused energy of someone who'd heard every version of every story and remained unshockable. I laid out everything: the group text, Diane's call, the Muller contract, the LLC, our joint financial accounts, the house. Frances said, "Does he know about the consulting contract?" I said, "He knows I got it. He doesn't know the amount." She said, "Good. Let's keep it that way for now." She asked me to gather everything. Financial records going back 5 years, any documentation of projects I'd led, client communications, bank statements, the LLC filings. She said, "He's going to claim contribution to your professional success. We need to be able to show specifically and clearly where his contribution actually began and ended." I went home that night and cooked dinner again. Owen came home. We ate. He told me about a meeting. I nodded. I asked follow-up questions. I was completely present and completely somewhere else at the same time. After he fell asleep, I sat at my desk until 2 in the morning building folders on my laptop, projects by year, by client, by dollar amount. I created a document I titled simply Record. Inside were the dates of every major milestone in my career, cross-referenced with Owen's employment history and our joint tax returns. The picture it painted was not complicated. Kevin called 2 nights later. He said he'd heard Owen had reached out to another associate at the firm, a woman named Petra who'd been friendly with me at a few industry events, asking her to keep an eye on whether I seemed off at any professional functions. He said Owen had used the phrase documenting a pattern. He'd given it a name, the record, his own version, running parallel to mine, designed to reach the opposite conclusion. I called Frances the next morning. She said, "This is actually useful. It shows premeditation." I asked her what our next step was. She said, "You're going to keep going to work. You're going to sign the Muller contract extension I assume Philip offered you." He had. "And then, when you're ready, we're going to have a conversation that ends this." I was ready sooner than I expected. It happened on a Sunday. Owen was on a call with what he said was a client, but I'd noticed the name on the screen when his phone lit up. It was Derek, his college roommate and a real estate attorney who did not do residential architecture consulting. I knew then. I didn't need more. I waited until he came back downstairs. He poured coffee. He asked me what I wanted to do about dinner. I looked at him across our kitchen. The kitchen I'd designed down to the cabinet pulls in the house whose down payment I'd funded with the Barton Hills bonus in 2017. And I said, "I know about Derek. I know about the group text. I know about Diane Rossiter and Petra and whatever it is you've decided to call what you've been building." He didn't say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "You're taking this out of context." I said, "No, Owen, I'm not." He tried 4 more things after that. Concern. "I've been worried about you." Reframing. "We've both been under pressure." Offense. "I can't believe you've been going through my things." And finally, very quietly, calculation. "Let's just be rational about this." I said, "I have an attorney. I'd like you to contact yours." He moved out 11 days later. Not because I asked him to. I didn't. The house was mine, legally and financially. Frances made that clear to his attorney in a single letter that referenced the down payment documentation and the fact that Owen's name had been added to the deed as a marital courtesy, not a financial contribution. He took the BMW he'd been making payments on from our joint account. He took his drafting table, his golf clubs, and 3 boxes of things. He left the Vitamix on the counter, which told me he'd packed in a hurry and wasn't thinking clearly. The divorce took 7 months. It was not easy. There was a period in month 3 when Owen's attorney tried to argue joint contribution to my professional reputation, that my success had been built partly on his networking and social facilitation. Frances dismantled this argument using 12 years of tax returns, 6 client testimony letters, and 1 very clear email from Philip Bauer stating that he had hired me, specifically and independently based on my proposal and my expertise alone. Philip had not been asked to write that email. He'd sent it voluntarily when he heard the claim was being made. Kevin testified too, It cost him some comfort at the firm, though Philip, to his credit, made clear that retaliation was not something he'd tolerate. Kevin sat across from the mediator and read from the group text with a steadiness that I don't think I could have managed in his position. Diane Rossiter submitted a written statement. So did the engineer from the Muller project, who'd worked with both Owen and me over the years and had a clear view of who did what. The final settlement gave me the house, the LLC, all associated contracts, and full professional independence. Owen received his personal investment accounts, mostly flat, and a non-compete clause that prevented him from approaching any of my current clients for 3 years. He signed everything on a Thursday morning. I wasn't in the room. Francis called me at noon to tell me it was done. I was at my desk reviewing revised specs for the Muller project's second phase, which had expanded to include 2 adjacent parcels. I said thank you. I finished the paragraph I was reading. Then I went outside and stood in the parking lot for a few minutes and let myself feel the full, quiet weight of what had happened. Not grief exactly. Something more like recognition. 9 years is a long time to love someone and a long time to slowly stop seeing yourself clearly. I'd been so careful not to outshine him that I'd started editing myself before I even opened my mouth. I'd grown so used to taking up less space that I'd stopped noticing how small I'd made myself. The Forbes Texas architecture feature ran 8 months after the divorce was finalized. A journalist named Caroline Bird had heard about the Muller project and wanted to write about women leading major commercial projects in the South. I told her I wasn't comfortable making the piece about my marriage. She said it didn't have to be. It could be about the work. It was about the work. It was also unavoidably about what happens when a woman stops waiting for permission to be taken seriously. The piece ran with a photograph of me standing on the Muller site in a hard hat, blueprints under my arm, the steel frame of the east wing rising behind me. The caption read, Mia Hartwell, Principal Architect, Hartwell Design Studio. 6 words. My name, my title, my studio. My phone rang for 3 days. A former professor called to say she'd shown the article to her current students. A woman I'd worked with briefly in 2018 sent a long message about her own situation that I won't share because it was hers, but I read it twice and cried a little in my car where no one could see. A client from Barton Hills forwarded the piece to her daughter who was applying to architecture school, and then there were the messages from people who didn't know me. Women mostly, but not only, who said some version of the same thing. I've been in that room. I know what it costs to speak up anyway. Thank you for doing it. I answered every one of them. It took 2 weekends. Kevin got promoted at Bauer Donnelly 6 months after the divorce. He called to tell me, and I could hear in his voice that he wanted to know if I thought he'd earned it or if it felt like a consolation. I told him it sounded earned. I meant it. He'd done a hard thing when he didn't have to, and I'd seen what it cost him in those months of uncertainty at the firm. Petra reached out eventually. Awkward. Honest, brief. She said she'd never actually reported anything to Owen, that she'd smiled at his request and quietly pretended she'd forgotten about it the next day. She didn't ask for absolution. She just wanted me to know. I thanked her. My mother called after the Forbes piece ran. She lives in Flagstaff, doesn't follow industry news, but my cousin had sent her the link. She said, I read it 3 times. I'm so proud of you. Then, after a pause, I want to say something and I need you to hear it without arguing. I said okay. She said, I saw it. When you 2 were together, the way he'd talk over you at family dinners or redirect the conversation right after you said something smart. I thought you knew what you were doing. I thought you'd chosen to let it go because you'd calculated it was worth it. I should have said something. I told her what I'd told others. I might not have heard it at the time. Some things you can only see from the other side of them. She said, that's generous of you. I said, it's just true. I ran into Owen once, about 14 months after the divorce was final. It was at a Home Depot in North Austin, which I mention only because the absolute mundaneness of it felt important. I was there for grout. He was in the paint aisle. He looked up when I walked past. We made eye contact. He opened his mouth slightly. The beginning of something, an acknowledgement, an apology, a renegotiation of reality. I'll never know. I gave him a small nod, the kind you give an acquaintance whose name you've half forgotten. Then I turned back to the display rack and found the grout I needed and walked to the register. I heard later from a mutual contact that he'd moved to Dallas and started over at a smaller firm. I hope it goes well for him. I mean that plainly, without performance. I'm not carrying anything about Owen anymore. It turned out the weight I'd been managing all those years was mostly just his. The Mueller project finished 14 months after I started it. We had a small completion dinner, my team, Philip, a few of the engineers. Somebody made a toast. I drank my wine and looked around at the people who had shown up and done the work, and I thought, this is what I was protecting when I finally stopped being careful. The east wing of the Creston complex, that's what the Mueller development became, won a regional AIA award the following spring. My name was on the plaque. Just mine. I have it on the shelf in my office now, between a photo of my first completed project in 2013 and a coffee mug that says, "Measure twice," that one of my drafters gave me for my birthday last year. It doesn't look like a trophy. It looks like a thing that belongs where it is. Most days that's exactly how I feel. If Mia's story stayed with you, hit that like button. It genuinely helps. And if you've ever been in a room where someone talked over something you built, leave a comment. I read everyone. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next from the Phantom Bonds. I've thought a lot about what made Owen do what he did. Not the dinner party moment, that was just the surface. I mean the slower thing. The 6 months of group texts, the calls to my former clients, the photographs of my sketchbooks with captions about therapy. That kind of sustained, methodical effort doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from a person who has looked at someone else's success and decided, on some level they might not even be fully conscious of, that the only way to stay even is to pull the other person down. That's not a character flaw you're born with. It's what happens when someone builds their identity around being the smartest one in the room, and then the room changes. Owen wasn't cruel when I married him. He was competitive, which I'd mistaken for ambition. He was charming, which I'd mistaken for confidence. He was good at taking up space, which I'd mistaken for leadership. None of those things are the same. I know the difference now. What I keep coming back to when I'm honest with myself is my own role in how long it went on. I don't mean that in a self-punishing way. I mean it practically. I had learned to make myself smaller so consistently for so long that I stopped noticing I was doing it. I'd stop mid-sentence in meetings if Owen was in the room. I'd frame my ideas as something we'd been discussing when they were mine alone. I turned down speaking invitations because they conflicted with his schedule, even when he hadn't asked me to. Nobody made me do those things. I did them because I thought that was what a good partner looked like. What I understand now is that accommodation without limits isn't partnership. It's disappearance. And disappearance slowly, quietly, with good intentions, is still disappearing. Kevin did a hard thing when he texted me that morning. He didn't have to. He was newer at the firm than Owen, less established, more exposed. There was real professional risk in what he did, and he did it anyway because he'd watched something wrong happening and couldn't keep watching. That kind of integrity is rarer than people say it is. I've tried not to forget it, not because I owe him anything at this point, but because it's worth remembering that being decent sometimes costs something, and people who pay that cost deserve to be seen clearly. Francis once told me, near the end of the process, that the cases that fall apart fastest are the ones where someone built their entire strategy on the assumption that the other person wouldn't act. Owen had counted on me staying quiet. He'd counted on the same instinct that had kept me editing myself in meetings for years. And when that calculation turned out to be wrong, he had nothing else. The whole structure collapsed because it had been built on a lie about who I was. That's the thing about spending years shrinking yourself for someone else's comfort. When you finally stop, you're bigger than either of you expected. The AIA plaque is on my shelf. The Mueller project is finished. My studio has 4 full-time staff now on a wait list. None of that happened because I was lucky or because something fell into place. It happened because I finally stopped treating my own judgment as a problem to be managed and started treating it as the thing I was actually here to use. I'm not carrying bitterness about the years before. There's no point to it, and I genuinely don't have space for it. But I do think about the woman who stood in that powder room at Philip's house and looked at herself in the mirror and decided, quietly and without drama, that she was done being careful about the wrong things. I think about her a lot. I'm glad she made that choice when she did.